Hello, Valley View Vikings, it's Mrs. Blackstone here, and we are going to start reading a new book. With Scholastic's permission, I will be presenting the book Wayside School, Sideways Stories from Wayside School. Now, this is written by Louis Sachar. This is a picture of Louis Sachar. He's the author. The author is somebody that writes a book, and this is illustrated. If you see at the very, very bottom, it says illustrated by Adam McCauley. An illustrator is somebody that draws the pictures. On the inside, we have our title page. Our title page is actually the second page in this book. The very first page is what we call a prologue. And a prologue is a little tiny bit of the story that happens before the actual book starts. And it just kind of helps you get used to reading the story. So sometimes when you go out for dinner, you'll have what's called an appetizer, and that makes you get excited for your meal. This is to help you get excited for your book. John was one of the smartest boys in Mrs. Jewell's class, but he had one problem. He could only read words written upside down. Nobody ever wrote anything upside down. But it was only a little problem. John was still in the high reading group. He just turned his book upside down. It was easier for John to turn his books upside down than to learn to read correctly. But the easiest way isn't always the best way. Mrs. Jewell said, "John, you can't go on reading like this. You can't spend the rest of your life turning your books upside down." "Why not?" John asked. "Because I said so," said Mrs. Jewell. "Besides, what happens when I write something on the blackboard? You can't turn the blackboard upside down." "No, I guess you're right," said John. "I know I'm right," said Mrs. Jewell. "You are going to have to learn to stand on your head." Are you interested in the rest of this book now? I certainly am. I have to wonder what kind of a teacher is going to tell her student to stand on his head to read a book. Can you stand on your head to read a book? I don't think so. The next page over here, this says, "In memory of Robert J. Sachar and to my mother, Andy and Jeff." This is what we call a dedication page. A dedication page is where the author gets to basically say thank you to the people that helped him write the book or inspired him to make him think about the story. When they say in memory of, it usually means that somebody has passed away and they're trying to think about that person and give their memory, they're trying to say that this book is in their memory, so we help remember the person when we read this book. Next, inside, we have the table of contents. Now, a table of contents shows us what is in the book. So right over here, we have our introduction. So that's going to tell us what is going to start the story. Can you tell me what page the introduction is on? Do you see? Yes, it's page 9. Good job. Now we have chapter number 1, Mrs. Gorf. What page should I start on if I want to start reading chapter number 1? What do you think? You're right, page 11. Nice job. Let's start with our introduction, though, on page 9. Here's our introduction. This is from the author. So this is the author telling you a little bit about the book. This book contains 30 stories about children and teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to them, there is something you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to only be 1 story high with 30 classrooms in a row. Instead, it is 30 stories high with 1 classroom on each story. The builder said he was very sorry. The children at Wayside like having a sideways school. They have an extra large playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to class on the top floor. So there are 30 stories from the 30th story of Wayside School. It has been said that these stories are strange and silly. That's probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought you were strange and silly. That's probably also true. Chapter 1, Mrs. Gorf. What do you think? What do you think about Mrs. Gorf just from looking at her picture? Do you think that she's going to be mean? Do you think she's nice? What do you think she likes? What do you see in the picture? Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher in Wayside School. She taught class on the 30th story. "If you children are bad," she warned, "or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples." Mrs. Gorf didn't like children, but she loved apples. Did you see all of the apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk? What do you think those apples are going to be? Joe couldn't add. He couldn't even count. But he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple. So he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, and then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Joe into an apple. Then she turned John into an apple for letting Joe cheat. "Hey, that isn't fair," said Todd. "John was only trying to help a friend." Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first the right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Todd into an apple. "Does anyone else have an opinion?" she asked. Nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. I would probably be really scared too. Would you be scared if your teacher turned you into an apple? What if Mrs. Blackstone walked into your room, wiggled her right ear, left ear, stuck out her tongue, and turned you into an apple? Yeah, I bet you would be scared. I would probably be scared too. "I do not allow crying in the classroom," said Mrs. Gorf. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet. And when they went home, they were too scared to even talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen couldn't go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were. Nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, "God bless you," when Paul sneezed. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, stuck out her tongue, and turned Nancy into an apple. Terrence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Mauricia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door as Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle. When she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear wiggled. Mauricia opened the door and 1 foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue. Bleh. Mauricia became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the others. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The 3 Erics laughed. They were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terrence, Mauricia, and the 3 Erics. Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Ovens. Lewis, the yard teacher, walked into the classroom. He had missed the kids at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher. So he came to investigate. What do you think? Do you think that he's going to find out that Mrs. Gorf is mean? Or do you think that Lewis is going to think that she's nice because she's an adult and so is he? What do you think? He saw the 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. I must be wrong, he thought. She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples. He walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Louis, the yard teacher, came back into the room. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. She must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all the children were apples. Mrs. Gorf was very happy. Now I can go home, she said. I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again. You're not going anywhere, shouted Todd. He jumped off the desk and bopped Mrs. Gorf on the nose. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor. The apples jumped all over her. Stop, she shouted, or I'll turn you into applesauce. But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. Turn us back into children, Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, bleh, wiggled her ears, this time her left one first, then her right, and turned her apples back into children. All right, said Maricia, let's go get Louis. He'll know what to do. No, screamed Mrs. Gorf. I'll turn you back into apples. She wiggled her ears, first her right one, then her left, and stuck out her tongue. Bleh. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple. But none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Louis, the yard teacher, walked in. Where's Mrs. Gorf? He asked. Nobody said a word. Boy, I'm hungry, said Louis. I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she always has so many. He picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it up on his shirt, and ate it. So what do you think about Mrs. Gorf? Were you right? Was she a nice teacher or a mean teacher? And what do you think about Louis and all of the kids that got turned into apples? And then, how did Mrs. Gorf get turned into an apple? Jenny held up a mirror, so Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. Good job. All right, I will see you later for Chapter 2, where we will talk about our new teacher, Mrs. Jules.